Hi everyone, in this video I want to give a brief overview of the Great Awakening. This is a topic that there's a lot of scholarship about and a lot of historians have disagreements about it. One of the things historians disagree about is how many Great Awakenings existed in US history. Traditionally there have been at least two, one in the colonial era and one in sort of the early republic, so one in the mid 18th century and one in the early 19th century. Some historians argue that there was actually just one ongoing Great Awakening that ebbed and flowed. This is something people get lots of articles written about. So some of this may disagree with some of what you read in your textbook or not, but I want just to give another perspective on this event in American history. And I'm going to take the perspective for our purposes that there was more than one. So when I talk about the Great Awakening, I'm talking about what some people call the First Great Awakening. So the U.S. tends to have a reputation of being a relatively religious country today. And I understand that everyone who is watching this video has different views or about religion in general, whether they are religious or not, whether they think religious is good or bad or something else. I'm aware of that. I'm not trying to convince you of anything about your views. Just saying that in general, the U.S. has had a reputation of being a religious country. It isn't always historically, though, been as religious as sometimes people assume that it is, particularly in the eyes of people who are very religious, who tend to think that over time, people have sort of fallen away from the faith, whatever that faith may be, and they aren't really doing what they should. And so after that sort of decline of religiosity, what has tended to happen really repeatedly through U.S. history, even in the colonial era, was a series of religious revivals. And this revival or reawakening of religious faith is the first sort of big one, is what we call the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening has its origins in New England, the 1740s. And you might recall from previous videos that New England was the place where the Puritans and the Separatists, two different groups, both settled and both wanted freedom to practice their own religion. They were Calvinists, followers of John Calvin, a Protestant reformer, and they were very famously, particularly the Separatists or the Pilgrims, not part of the Church of England, but even eventually the Puritans essentially left the Church of England. And so in the maybe the late 16, early 1700s, the Puritans and the Separatists more or less combined forces and formed what became known as the Congregational Church, which was essentially a state church in much of New England. Now, we think, of course, of the U.S. having separation of church and state. Remember, that is something that starts with the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That was not something that was true in the colonial era. And so New England in the 1740s was very, very, very Puritan by that time, or Congregationalist. And Puritan theology taught that there was a sequence of decline and revival in sort of the Christian community. And that idea really had some resonance in general with Protestant Christians who tended to think that was true of the Christian church in general, that the Christian church had declined during the Middle Ages when the Roman Catholic Church was the dominant religion in Western and Central Europe. And then that decline was revived and the church was renewed with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, according to the typical thinking of Protestant Christians at this time. And so there was an ongoing, relatively typical sequence of decline and revival that was actually part of sort of Puritan thought. And the key figure in the Great Awakening was Jonathan Edwards. And Edwards was a minister. He was trained at Yale, and he was brilliant intellectually. He was born in 1703. He finished his training at Yale in 1720 when he was around 17. And so he was a minister at various places in New England. Shortly before his death, He became the president of what would become Princeton University. At the time was called the College of New Jersey. And what Edwards thought, among other things, or what he came to think anyway, that salvation wasn't just an intellectual change. It wasn't just someone saying, oh yes, I've decided I'm going to become a Christian. It was an emotional change, an internal change, a change of a person's heart. And this was associated with really deep feelings and emotions and passion about religion, passion about religious experience. Now, these deep emotions were usually very controversial in terms of religion. A lot of people, even today, get very uncomfortable when people have really strong emotions in public. And this is nothing new. And so emotions in terms of things like religion or politics, for that matter, tended to be really controversial. Edwards is best known for the work that I've pictured here, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It is a sermon he preached near the beginning of the Great Awakening. It is not an easy read. It's very much written in an early 1700s style. And basically, Edwards, that title is exactly what he is saying. This was typical Puritan theology, was that all people are sinners and God will punish them if they don't repent, essentially. And if you don't repent, God is going to be angry with you, essentially. And so this sermon and others like it had a really powerful effect. And over time, churches became split into new lights and old lights. And so-called new light churches were churches that favored this idea of revivals, and they felt that emotion had a place in religion. And old lights, on the other hand, were people who did not think that. Like, they were more traditional. They wanted to worship in a traditional fashion. Traditional for that church. Like, not traditional as in, oh, we're going to go back to Roman Catholic traditions. But traditional in, we are going to have services the way this Congregational church has always had services, or the way this Anglican church has always had services. So churches split during this time period a lot. And the other key figure is George Whitefield, who did a series of sermons across the U.S. And you see a map here of his routes from about 1739 to 41. And you know that if you may or may not be able to see this, depending how clear it is, but he, for example, in 1740 visited Jonathan Edwards at Edwards's church at that time. So Whitefield traveled throughout the colonies, and it was a huge media event. I say here he was the second most famous preacher of the era behind Edwards, but honestly, Edwards, despite the passion that could come in his preaching, was much more intellectual. Like, he was known for his writings, and Whitefield really got out there. Like, he was famous in his day. And in fact, he used contemporary mass media practices to spread his message. He believed that if he could get his message out there, it was a worthwhile thing to do. So he used the burgeoning press a lot. So there were advertisements placed in newspapers, but even beyond that, newspapers would talk about him coming because they knew it was going to be a huge event. And so it would sell newspapers. And in fact, Whitefield became sort of business allies and even friends with publishers, including Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin was definitely not of a similar theological persuasion as George Whitefield. And so Whitefield was a really interesting character. And what we sometimes call people like Whitefield was an itinerant minister. In other words, itinerant ministers don't have just one church that they're responsible for. In fact, they don't have any churches they're responsible for. An itinerant minister goes from community to community as he feels called to do so. And I'm going to use he here because at this time, this was overwhelmingly a masculine activity. This is actually one of the reasons the Great Awakening was controversial at its time, was because traditionally, the minister was a minister of a church. That was that person's often full-time job, and that person was considered responsible for the spiritual well-being and health of his parishioners. And these itinerant ministers were just sort of wandering around, and they were, taking clients essentially. So that was one of several reasons why this was a really controversial movement at the time. So with the growth of the New Lights, what really happened was there was a shift from loyalty to a denomination to instead an internal religion, a religion of the heart. And what this led to was tremendous growth in new Protestant denominations, growth in the Baptist denomination of Protestant Christianity, growth in Presbyterianism, and growth eventually, a few years later, I believe, in Methodism. So this is really changing the religious landscape of colonial America. And it had a couple of important effects. And I can't find a really great map of the Great Awakening, or even of colonial religion. But essentially, the area here that's in green were the New England colonies. And those colonies tended to be congregational. And remember, the Congregational Church was a combination of Puritans and Separatists. Very conservative in general. There were exceptions, like Rhode Island was founded as a haven for religious freedom and stuff like that. But in general, New England was overwhelmingly this congregational Puritan church. And then what's called the Chesapeake colonies, you might recall, are colonies like Maryland, Virginia. Delaware is kind of sometimes considered Chesapeake and sometimes not. So the Chesapeake colonies tended to be overwhelmingly Anglican. So Anglican was the official state church of England at the time. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the middle colonies were kind of a melting pot of their era. Sort of almost everything went. We know that Pennsylvania had religious freedom for anyone who wasn't an atheist. And so Pennsylvania had Congregationalists, they had Anglicans, they had Quakers. It was founded by Quakers. They had Jews, they had Roman Catholics, they had Baptists, they had Reformed churches, and so on and so forth. And this was to an extent true throughout this region. And then the southern colonies, the Carolinas and Georgia, also tended to be Anglican. And so what the Great Awakening does is it ends congregational dominance in New England, and it starts to open the way for different denominations to exist there that really hadn't had a foothold there before. And it does the same sort of thing in the Chesapeake and in the southern colonies as well with the Anglican Church. You may have heard of Thomas Jefferson's his idea of the separation of church and state, and he said once that there is a wall separating church and state, and that comment was actually made once by Jefferson in a letter, and it was a letter, if I'm remembering correctly, to Baptists in Connecticut who wanted to make sure that Congregationalism wasn't going to become the state church in Connecticut. And so a policy that has become really widespread and is thought of as being part of the Constitution really emerges from this one almost offhanded comment that Jefferson writes in a letter. And then if you want more information about the Great Awakening, there are many books about the history of religion in America. Here are some of them that I used as I was preparing this. If you have other questions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.